Good day, everyone, and welcome to this TIPS webinar and development dialogue on the transition to electric vehicles. It's really my pleasure to welcome you today to this exciting event. My name is Gaylor Montmasson-Clair. I'm a senior economist at TIPS. I lead our work around sustainability and just transition, and will be the moderator for today's session. I think today's discussion is very timely, and we'll get into the meat of it. But of course, the transition to electric vehicles and e-mobility more broadly is underway in South Africa and globally, and accelerating very rapidly. South Africa in 2023 published its new energy vehicle white paper that sets the vision for South Africa's industry and South Africa's value chain in the sector. And we'll delve into that white paper today, as well as some connected consideration, focusing primarily on the transition of the industrial value chain, so more on the manufacturing side of things. Before we jump right in, please note that, of course, this session is recorded and will be shared with you as well after the event. We will also make available, to the extent possible, the presentations and inputs into the session. Please keep this session lively and entertaining. You can use the chat function to introduce yourself, chat with fellow attendees, as well as pose some questions to our panelists. So please go ahead. We'll mostly ask you to keep your mic and camera off unless you're invited to speak, so that you don't disrupt the flow of the event. We have 4 key inputs today from various entry points, more on the research side and skills, from the value chain and the industry specifically, more from a academic and labor background as well, and also a bit of sharing from another country, specifically India, so that we can see how India has done it or is doing it at the moment, and what are potential lessons for South Africa's transition. Before we delve into our program, I will provide a little bit of background, very briefly, on the NEV transition and the NEV white paper, which is available on the DTIC website. But to make sure that we're all on the same page, share a little bit of what's in that particular document, and that we can have then really a robust discussion together over the next 90 minutes. The first thing to say, of course, is that there is no denying that the transition to new energy vehicle is underway globally. And you can see on the left-hand side the sales of new energy vehicles on an exponential trajectory. And you can see that as well on the right-hand side, rising sales and in numbers, but also in increasing shares of total sales. What we must point out, though, of course, is that this transition is currently dominated by a few jurisdictions. China clearly is world leader, but also Europe and the US. The rest of the world is still much behind, and that still opens up some opportunities, of course, because there are a number of pioneers, and among them, of course, in volume China, in total percentage of sales. Norway really leading the pack, but the bulk of the world is still grappling with that transition. And of course, we are in that bag, still understanding how we can position ourselves. And so it's really important to understand that, yes, there are a few leaders, but actually, we're not necessarily behind if we compare that on a global basis. We see that, of course, as well when it comes to production. The production of EVs has been growing significantly. These are the leading manufacturers globally in 2022 of electric vehicles, and you can see the growth rates compared to 2021. In some cases, 200% increase in production. It's really large increases, as of course electric vehicles start to displace the production of internal combustion engine globally. South Africa, we have an important automotive industry. We have 7 key OEMs that produce vehicles in the country, and of course a number of tier 2 and tier 3 companies that really feed into that value chain and provide components. And I know that we'll hear from NICAM on the breadth and depth of that and the opportunities and challenges around this. Globally, South Africa is the 22nd largest producers of automotive vehicles. So very much, I would say, it's a sort of second tier, but really integrated in global value chains quite significantly. And so again, important to understand that we are part of a bigger picture. We also see that if we look at South Africa's production and exports of vehicle, we see that in 2022, almost 70% of the vehicle produced in South Africa were exported, primarily to the EU and in the UK, 2 destinations that are rapidly transitioning to EVs. But the opposite is true. We're also very integrated in terms of imports, where about 2/3 of our vehicles sold in South Africa were similarly imported into the country. So very much part of global dynamics. And again, that is really important to grasp. We are not transitioning in isolation. What about the sales of new energy vehicles in the country? Still small, of course, but starting to rise. In 2023, totaled 2.2% of new vehicle sales. That's for passenger cars. Primarily, we see these are soft hybrid vehicles. Of course, if we exclude these and focus on battery as well as plug-in hybrids, then the sales are significantly smaller. But it is a start of a dynamic, early days still, but something to work with and to nurture so that it carries on and grows. But that again, not in the spectrum of the world leaders, but certainly in the pack of countries globally that are grappling with that transition. And I think that's important to position this. Importantly, of course, we already have a policy framework. We're going to detail here, but we have a number of schemes that already support the automotive industry to manufacture vehicles and parts and components into the country. 3 main components, and of course, it's a lot more complex than what's on the slide, but we don't have a lot of time. Tariff is one of them. Product local production. We have a number of tariff on certain product, and I know this is something that the automotive industry always talks about when it comes to NEV production. That certain EV vehicles attract a higher tariff than their petrol or diesel counterpart. But there is a framework in place around those particular tariff, around 18% for most vehicles. some exceptions, tax at 25%. That includes the BEVs coming from Europe, BEVs only, but also some vehicles tax at 0%. And that's those to be below 1,000 cc's. And so how we maintain that tariff book to keep our access to the market, but also maintain protection is important. Then we've got a number of instruments to support value addition. They are called the VALA and the PI, that's the volume assembly, localization allowance, and the production incentive. Effectively, they reward OEM for local value addition in different ways. They're not directly impacted, those schemes, by the transition to NEVs, but of course, what gets localized has an impact. And if the battery doesn't get localized, it has an impact on the share of value addition that can be achieved by OEMs and would have an impact on what they can be granted. And last but not least, we have the automotive investment scheme that backs automotive investment, and it's a cash grant for investment in manufacturing for components, but also for vehicle assembly. And here it's quite generous if we look at it at face value. But importantly, it is within a broader ecosystem, and our competition is also providing substantial investment, and that is what we need to compare ourselves against. Is it attractive enough to enable OEMs to retool, reline, and produce EVs? So that is really a brushstroke presentation on the current framework that is here. If we look at it effectively in terms of the current framework, we can see that it's largely relevant and appropriate to support the NEV transition. There are the right elements in place, but there's three things that still have to be considered. One is the fact that we have very little domestic market for EVs. As I showed, it's still very small. How do we address this? Because local production relies both on exports and the domestic market. How we deal with duties, particularly to make sure that it doesn't impair production, but it also protects production and it still enables the market to operate, particularly when it comes to the import of batteries until such day as they are made in South Africa. And is the investment support sufficient? It is generous on face value, but it is to be considered against our competition. So what does the NEV white paper, which was published in 2023, say? I decided to extract a few quotes from it to kind of illustrate what the white paper says. It's a very short summary of it. The first thing is that it certainly acknowledges that the EV transition is critical for South Africa's industrial policy and industrial revolution. And it puts a lot of emphasis on the automotive industry strength and the fact that it is a key industry in the pursuit of a net zero economy and of a green economy going forward. It also stresses the fact that allowing the South African automotive industry to decline without the appropriate support is not an option for the South African government. So it is clear that action is required and should be taken. And it's then, of course, that it puts forward the policy goals and action that will be taken to support new energy vehicle production and consumption. There's 6 core principles that are being highlighted in the NEV white paper. The fact that it should be taken at a pace that is right for South Africa. It is necessary, but the pace at which it must be taken is urgent, but at the same time must be done along the way of what we can afford and what can be done. It is meant to be technology agnostic and not favor one technology over another, although acknowledging that, of course, we're not talking about supporting NEV vehicles. And so acknowledging that there's a breadth of technologies, plug-ins, soft hybrids, batteries, but also fuel cell vehicles, and potentially others in the future. It acknowledges that investment support is required, that the policy actions must be cost reflective and sustainable financially, and that it is an opportunity to deepen effectively localization in the value chain. and that the goal is to have a just transition of the automotive industry in line with, of course, South Africa's just transition framework that was adopted. Then the white paper goes and says, well, there's two key areas. There's production and there's consumption. Production is earmarked as the primary area for action in the white paper, while consumption will be looked at in the coming years. It does see, production as a major opportunity. Particularly, it is stressed the production of batteries, or the value chain from critical minerals to batteries, is stressed as a particular opportunity for South Africa and the region more broadly. It stresses that it is about all stakeholders, government, business, labor, to achieve that transition. That must work together, and put some milestones in place about announcements in the 2024 budget speech that is, of course, around the corner, and further announcements going forward. It has a number of interventions on the production side, which obviously we don't have time to go into detail of, but it really kind of shows how potentially the existing framework is to be tweaked to really cater for the transition to NEVs, and that's about our tariff, our AIS, our VALA, our PI that I've just introduced. It looks at regional integration and collaboration, particularly around batteries. It looks at R&D as well as network infrastructure in rail, in ports, and in certification. And so there's an array of interventions that are being put forward and are being front-loaded in the production area of electric vehicles. This is what we're going to focus on today. For completeness, there's also a number of interventions that are being put forward on the consumption side, pushing for market demand. You would notice that these are only going to be considered later on, from 2026, 2027, and 28 onwards, looking at how to grow the demand for electric vehicle in South Africa. So that hopefully provides you a good background for you to understand the current state of play and what is the direction of travel globally, but also in South Africa for the automotive industry going forward. It's now my pleasure to introduce Renee as our first panelist, who is the Executive Director of NACAM, that is the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers. He's also the chairperson of the South African Automotive Industry Export Council and a director of the South African Tire Manufacturers Conference and a board member of Mercita. So you can gather just in these two lines that Renee is really vested in the automotive value chain in South Africa, and we're very fortunate to have him with us. Renee, thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hello. Morning. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for the introduction. I won't spend too much of time because I think a topic like this has, to some extent, been one of the more exciting or key talking points for the auto sector for a couple of years now. If you allow me, I would like to maybe shape my input into today's webinar along the lines of actually what has been, at least from a component manufacturing perspective, our kind of thinking around things that need to happen in the policy and ecosystem space as we get into, let's call it, this new framework of NEV production in South Africa. So, of course, I'm sure many of the colleagues on the call know the role of myself, my organization, and what we do. I think for today's kind of discussion, I want to make it very clear. not only myself, but I think the entire NARCAM structure, its leadership, we are firm proponents of greater manufacturing depth, localization, greater capture of whatever happens in terms of value addition for vehicle production in South Africa for companies that are based domestically. And I think that's the departure point for all of our interactions or engagements in the space to date. I have kind of shared a few slides. I'm going to click through them. I hope that they are effectively doing the same on those that are seeing it. If there's any issue, maybe just pop me a note on the side somewhere if someone from the admin team. Not to spend too much of time on who our organization is. We effectively the voice of component manufacturers based here in South Africa, typically dominant those supplying into OEM plants, the large 7 light motor vehicle plants in South Africa, but a number of our members also going into exports and independent aftermarket. What we would do is typical of an industry body in the space, so I'm not going to spend too much of time on that. The next couple of slides I'm going to share out of industry commission research that was done on behalf of the Auto Supply Chain Competitiveness Initiative, of which we as NARCAM are part of the structures and effectively play a facilitation role. It's delivered together with our partners from an OEM space, from a labor space, and of course through the lead department being DTIC. So this is out of technology, an ASCII access to technology range of studies. I think it's important just to map out from a manufacturing perspective what the kind of transition in terms of powertrain production is, especially as we start talking about, for example, full-on battery electric vehicle production. I think, as you can see very clearly, the transition from a pure internal combustion engine to a BEV, the huge differences tend to be in some of the NEV-specific components, whether it's the battery, e-motor and transmission, some of the thermal management systems, power electronics, and high voltage wiring harnesses. When we start talking about an FCEV, that then gets added on in terms of the hydrogen fuel cell and tanks needed. I suppose there's a lot more technical detail that we can go into there, but just for ease of discussion, you're looking at very low voltage battery and large unit production in terms of engine and transmission in a pure ICE, and then the situation completely reversed as you get into the pure BEV. So what did these studies end up doing is, at least from a South African perspective, identified NEV components with high localization potential. These were obviously deemed feasible on the back of availability on raw materials, the kind of companies and technology already based here in South Africa. I don't really want to go into a high level of detail of what the opportunities are and in which particular spaces. But again, if you look at what I've already mapped out as NEV-specific subcomponents as I was describing that transition, I think you'll find that there's parts of some of it which there are definitely potential for localization in South Africa. So why am I saying all of this? Often when we talk about a transition to NEV production in the country, sometimes it gets hyped. And I often get asked a question, is the supplier base ready for it? I think the supplier base has always been ready for any technology change that comes from an OEM platform. ICE technology changes all the time. Vehicle models change effectively every 7 years. If you look at when planning was done for the SA Autos Masterplan, it was deliberately done over a 15-year period, which is 2 model life cycles. So the supplier base, by virtue of the global nature of autos production, whether they're multinationals or whether they're South African-based suppliers with global partnerships, licensing agreements, and the like, they've been kind of transitioning to or responding to technology changes all of the time. And the kind of view that I'm putting out there is that the supplier base transition as and when OEM announcements are made and market changes happen. I think in terms of at least the one topic that has come out very clearly, and that is you even seeing it in the white paper, a very strong prevalence to see how the country can make greater use of the battery manufacturing opportunity. At least in South Africa, what is the business case for this to happen here? You've already got a well-supported autos manufacturing sector with long-standing government policy frameworks and a very robust sector-specific engagement structure that works. South Africa is strategically located, and of course, I'm not going to get into debates about effectiveness of logistics and port supply at the moment, but it is or has been a long-standing advantage. Of course, the access to key raw materials in the region is really key, and already having a very strong base of autos manufacturing. Our own view, and as you saw coming out in the white paper, was an alignment of thinking that you need to have a very strong regional policy alignment for battery manufacturing. Something that came out very clearly from our membership base, especially those who have the potential to play a role in the battery manufacturing value chain. Ultimately, it comes down to demand certainty, not only from OEMs, but how is it other sectors can be leveraged, both from an industrial and consumer storage capability. But the potential is there. Can it be realized tomorrow? Probably not. There's going to have to be some phasing of how all of these things come into play before you can get into proper full-on battery cell manufacturer, but at least from an assembly capability. And as you see, conditions in the white paper announcement talking to similar thing. If anything, all I've been saying all along is that the supply base is ready for the transition. Announcements need to be made, and then I suppose the formal process in which suppliers contract with OEMs for production can then kick off. Long story short, we've already got capability in the NEV space where South African supply companies are already supplying into global export markets. And that has already kind of been seen in terms of FCEVs as well. I've made the point previously, suppliers respond to technology changes, whether it's ICE, whether it's EVs. I think the important thing to understand right now is that many components produced locally are not powertrain specific. So if you think of suspension components as a good example, whether it's in the EV space or an ICE space, it simply means those who are supplying into those systems would need some sort of regrading or change in terms of the specs that they're producing to, but ultimately process and technology will be a response to things that they've been kind of doing already. Why have I been saying all of this? My own sense is that from a production perspective, and we already see it, we're already seeing it in announcements by Ford, BMW, Mercedes has been doing plug-in hybrid for some time already. The reality is, I don't think you're going to have a single OEM plant tomorrow or on a particular date in the future say, stop, we're not going to do ICE, pure ICE anymore. We're completely moving over to BEV. There's going to be a mix of production that happens, whether it's a combination of ICE for a particular market, plug-in hybrid for a particular market, soft hybrid for some of the markets, even moving into BEV for certain markets. But that happens on the basis of how OEMs control their production lines. I think you can get the sense that in a particular plant, you can have different variants happening in different assembly processes. Where you've got NEV specific components, those then feed into an assembly line that already kind of does the same in an ICE space. In terms of, again, to prove the point around readiness, I happened to attend an event in Germany sometime last year. Just if you have a look at these kind of logos here, these are all South African-based component manufacturers, and they were kind of exhibiting in a mobility show purely from an EV perspective. Again, underscore the point. get an announcement about an EV production setup, and you've got the base that can transition. We've been very strong as NOCAM in kind of supporting a view on that there's already a production policy in space or in place, the APDP under the SAREM Masterplan. We were strong on a view that said additional technology or production incentives that were needed, and you saw that coming out. There were discussions around significantly reduced duties for imported components. We were not too keen on that. What you're seeing on this slide is out of our kind of research done across the membership base, what we were seeing as key requirements in the transition. Gaylor, you touched on a lot of this. This can be found out of the NEV white paper in terms of what the incremental steps are being taken into. As you can see, if you look at what NOCAM has been positioning through the period of getting into the publication of the white paper, of course, we were one of the key constituents that at all times were being consulted as this was being developed. At least in terms of a production perspective, we've kind of welcomed the publication of the white paper to have a focus on the continued growth and development of local manufacturing capability and localization. Our sense was that there was a balance for general competitiveness enhancing measures and also the need for energy and network industries to reform. I think if we talk about development of domestic consumer ecosystem, greater sales of NEVs and the like, it wasn't kind of immediately clear in terms of the white paper where that would go. Minister said that would be the next phase of policy iterations in terms of consuming or understanding what comes out in the local ecosystem. So for now, the focus on ensuring production to match global market requirements. I think what's been announced is a reasonable kind of complementary to what was already a technology agnostic APDP set of measures. I think for us, we just kind of at the point of saying it's good. There's now something on paper. We've been talking for a long time. Let's see some movement in the domestic industry and the supplier base, and ourselves as NOCAM are ready to support. So thanks, Gaylor.
Superb. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Renee. I think that really puts a lot of context into the position of the value chain, and really kind of makes it clear where we sit as a country as the value chain and the sort of component manufacturers. If you have any questions for Renee, please pop them in the chat, and we'll get to them a little later. Without further ado, I want to now introduce my colleague, Lesejo. Lesejo is a senior economist at TIPS, and she has a lot of expertise on industrial policy, in particular around the battery energy storage value chains and the emergence of new energy vehicles in the country, particularly on skills development. And so she will be presenting some work that TIPS has been doing on, as it says on the slide there, the automotive industry skills gap. So Lesejo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gaylor, and to the team for the opportunity to present some of our research findings on the automotive skills gap analysis. And I think, with the white paper making it clear that it's going to follow a production-led transition towards NEVs, it becomes very important for us to start thinking about skills and to also ensure that we have some sort of skills readiness plan in place to ensure not only that we have the right skills, but also we have the right number of people who are able to work in the NEV system to support that ecosystem. And so this work is based on work that TIPS has done research on last year, and it's actually part of a bigger research project that looks at developing a strategic skills roadmap to support the automotive industry value chain in South Africa. And so that also looks at the 4IR curriculum and also ensuring that there is support for SMMEs. And so for the TIPS team, we were looking at the changing dynamics in the labor market in the South African automotive industry, particularly around answering the question of, when we're seeing these disruptions happening in the automotive value chain and seeing the emergence of new industries and new activities, what sort of skills are emerging and occupations that are emerging, ones that are transforming or changing, and also occupations that are at risk. And so in this presentation, I'm going to highlight some of those occupations as well as our research findings based on that very important question. So in terms of the objectives of the labor market analysis, it provided contextual background on labor market dynamics in the automotive industry, and also mapping the occupations against the core value chain segment process in order to identify the existing occupations and occupations that are transforming and emerging, as I mentioned. And ultimately, the goal was to provide and also to identify priority occupations that are important in terms of supporting this NEV transition as well as ecosystem. And for South Africa particularly, I think because of some of the challenges we faced around skill shortages as well as low productivity in the automotive industry, it really does become important for us to ensure that when it comes to transitioning, that we are ready in terms of the skills development and training. So before I go into some of our research findings, I thought that it would just be important to highlight the employment trends in the automotive industry, because we know that the automotive industry is very important, especially for downstream jobs. And also when we're thinking about automotive industry jobs, especially when we look at vehicle manufacturing and component manufacturing, these are high-paid jobs that are protected and unionized. So it becomes very important for us to ensure that when it comes to thinking about the transition and the disruption that it causes, that we ensure that there is minimal impact and risk on job losses in the automotive industry, because they are that important. But I think when we speak about job losses, there are also opportunities that present themselves in terms of the entire value chain from a job creation perspective, but also when you're looking at the introduction of new startups. And I think that then brings the opportunity for us to increase participation for youth and participation for women as well. And we've actually been seeing some initiatives from other countries globally that are actually targeted at ensuring that there are more women and youth entering the EV ecosystem. And I think that's something that's really important. And so in our paper, we highlighted these trends, but we also looked at demographics, which was very important because, the automotive industry globally remains male dominated. And again, it's important for us to think about how to create these opportunities to make the transition a lot more inclusive, and also to ensure that we are not leaving women behind as well as the youth. And in the South African context, you do know that it's also important to look at transformation from a race perspective. And so the transition actually gives us the opportunity to ensure that when we have new suppliers participating as well as new startups, that these are actually Black-owned suppliers and entrepreneurs joining the value chain. And also, age is also something that we identified as being very important to look into when we're thinking about skills, when we're thinking about training, especially because when we looked at our data, the median age of an employee in vehicle assembly is 40 to 49. And we know that when it comes to technological changes, older workers, older people tend to be a lot more resistant. And so that affects the motivation as well as their behavior towards adopting these new technologies. And then another important aspect as well is the education attainment. So we looked at education attainment in vehicle manufacturing as well as in component manufacturing. And we found that in both component and vehicle manufacturing, a lot of the workers are actually in possession of a matric qualification. And this is something that has actually been increasing over years, and it is a good thing. And I think it also shows that there has also been increased requirements from employers for workers to have at least a matric. And this is also a very important aspect, especially when we think about training, because having that good, solid educational foundation becomes really important for the transition that we're speaking about, because it's one that actually requires highly skilled workers. And I think it's also worth mentioning that we're also seeing, in terms of education attainment, especially in component manufacturing, we are seeing that there's an increase in the number of individuals who are actually attaining qualifications such as degrees and diplomas. So in terms of the assessment of NEV transition on occupations in the automotive industry, this is the methodological approach that we took. And so we looked at existing occupations, and this was using the WSP and OFO database. And we also looked at occupations that are in transition or occupations that are changing across the automotive value chain. And with this, we looked at Masita survey data, as well as conducting desktop research. We also looked at emerging occupations, and particularly for the South African context, there wasn't that much information. So we really had to rely on desktop research, as well as a few interviews in order to identify some of these emerging occupations in the automotive industry. And I think it's also important to just point out the constraint around the OFO database, especially when it comes to emerging occupations, because it doesn't actually have a full list of these occupations. So it does require updating. And it also doesn't cover the informal sector, which I will get into, because when we're speaking, for example, about informal mechanics, we know that, this is a labor-intensive sector in the value chain, and it's important to ensure that we at least know the number of people that we're talking about when we talk about informal mechanics in the automotive industry. So in terms of identifying occupations that are at risk and also occupations that are changing, when we look at occupations that are at risk, we are looking at occupations that are likely to disappear because of the NEV transition. And then in terms of transforming occupations, these are occupations that will remain, but then they will require changes in skills. So there's a lot of upskilling that is required for these occupations. And also the ILO has done quite a lot of work looking at this change that's taking place in the automotive industry. And so they've identified that there are at least 6 occupations that will be undergoing a transforming phase in the automotive industry value chain. And I think that's very, very important to note. But for the South African context, when we looked at occupations that are at risk, for example, in auto assembly, we found that there are actually very few occupations that are at risk. However, there are a number of occupations that will require upskilling, and these are occupations that are considered highly skilled. So if you look at, excuse me, so if you look at the table on the slide, you notice that there are 2 different colors. So there's gray and blue. So the gray represents highly skilled occupations, whereas blue is medium skill occupations. So in retail, we've identified that nearly all occupations, although they might not be at risk, they will require training. So this speaks to salespeople, insurers, marketing, who need to understand the specifications of NEVs as well as safety. And then when we are talking about safety, it's also important to note that we're also talking about first responders, and that is an existing occupation, but then it would require intensive training, especially when you're talking to firefighters, the police, and medical personnel, because we know with EVs, because of the batteries, they are high voltage vehicles, and the fires are very different to an ICE fire, for example. So it's important to ensure that there is sufficient training to make sure that if someone was to be stuck in an accident involving an NEV, then first responders know what to do and how to handle that situation. And in terms of the aftermarket, these are mostly medium skills, so diesel mechanic, for example. And we mentioned that, like, although this occupation might not completely disappear, but then there will be a significant reduction in demand for such occupations. And I think also another important thing to note, and this is something that Renee also mentioned, when it comes to looking at these occupations and changing labor market dynamics, especially in the South African context, it's also important to note that this all depends on the NEV adoption rate and the scale of production and the sales in the country, right? And that will all influence how quickly these occupations are changing. But then another factor that's important to consider when we're thinking about these changes is also the type of vehicles that we will be seeing in South Africa, and also the timeframes around that, because that will impact these changes and us having to now think about, where do we train, and as well as, long-term, short-term, and medium-term. So for occupations that are emerging, I did mention that there is an update of the framework that is required to ensure that these occupations are captured accurately in the South African OFO classification system. And so in terms of emerging occupations, we are seeing the increased demand in software skills, R&D skills, electronic engineer, cybersecurity, as well as skills for smart grids, and also in the renewable energy sector, which is very important in supporting that EV ecosystem. And so for auto assembly, for emerging occupations, this is mostly for plugins and BEVs. We will be seeing, or are seeing in other parts of the world, that have managed to increase production quite significantly. We are seeing the demand for high voltage technicians and engineers, for example, as well as electrochemical equipment assemblers, among other occupations. And then within the value chain of electric vehicles, the big component is the battery, right? And so we are also seeing emerging occupations in cell manufacturing and battery assembly related occupations, and this includes R&D, certification, and also emerging occupations and jobs in the circular economy. So that's around e-waste and the recycling of batteries, even though those are likely to be high skills, because when you look at battery recycling, for example, it's quite R&D intensive, and it does require that scientific and those technical expertise. And then for retail and aftermarket, we are seeing new occupations that will be created in the aftermarket, particularly, for example, for conversions of ICE vehicles to ICE, and also the repair of lithium-ion batteries. There are also services such as battery swapping, and we are seeing jobs in that activity or in that industry, which is really important because these are mostly labor-intensive jobs. And so when you're looking at, for example, Kenya and the two-wheeler and three-wheeler market, you are seeing an increase in jobs for battery swapping, and those are labor-intensive, which is great because we know that the automotive industry is largely capital-intensive and automated industry. So it's important that, again, when we look at this transition, we look to see where we can create those labor-intensive jobs, seeing that most jobs will be your highly skilled jobs. And then for infrastructure and vehicle use, many of the emerging occupations in infrastructure are in jobs that have actually opened up opportunities for newly trained and existing workers in manufacturing, in vehicle manufacturing, and also in other related sectors. So, for example, your electricians, your engineers, and your site planners. And so here the table just shows some of the emerging occupations that we have identified in vehicle assembly, in retail, aftermarket, and also in vehicle use. And then lastly, I thought that it would be also important to touch on skills development and training. This is a very important part of the South Africa's automotive Masterplan, for example, and also the white paper does highlight the importance of skills development and training, especially when it comes to reskilling in the aftermarket, the upskilling of electricians, and also when we think about an inclusive and just transition, in the automotive industry, we're not only just looking at increasing, for example, gender, the participation of women and youth, but also in ensuring that, for example, with informal mechanics and electricians that do operate in the industry, that they're not left behind, and we find ways to actually ensure that they are qualified in order to support the ecosystem. And so in terms of reskilling in the aftermarket, so I thought that I would focus on petrol attendance. So when it comes to data on petrol attendance, StatSA has data on fuel retailers, but then it aggregates petrol attendants with distributors and other workers in that industry. And so we're not able to disaggregate the data, but then according to some sources online, apparently, so there are approximately 70,000 workers in South Africa who are employed as petrol attendants. And this is particularly important because when it comes to petrol attendants in the country, they benefit from the Petroleum Product Act, and that says that, you know, you cannot put petrol in your car, and it has to actually be done by a professional and qualified individual. So that maintains the role of the petrol station attendants. And so with NEVs, charging stations are currently self-service, where we've seen across the world and globally, and also in South Africa, the ones that we do have. Therefore, petrol attendants risk losing their jobs with no prospect of being absorbed in the NEV charging. And I think that also speaks to, so you have this important regulation that supports petrol station workers or petrol attendants, but it's not really keeping up with the shifts that are taking place in the labor market. And so it becomes important that there is a resolve when it comes to this conflict, so that those jobs are at least protected. And also reskilling, again, requires a strong education foundation. And then I also touch on the upskilling of electricians. So NEVs required qualified electricians, including high voltage electricians. And in South Africa, there are even fewer qualified voltage electricians. And what we see now is that currently, if we were to assess the skills landscape, there are not enough qualified electricians to actually support the transition to NEVs or the NEV ecosystem, because we also know that there is this increased demand for electricians in the renewable energy sector. And so the increased demand for electricians as a result of NEVs could lead to serious shortages of electricians in the country, and that would really impact negatively on the transition, especially given that it's an electrified transition, where having those skills is very, very important. And then lastly, just touching on the case of informal mechanics. So the demand for informal mechanics for ICE and NEV markets is likely to increase in both quantity and also the level of advanced technical skills that are required. And in South Africa, when we look at the StatSA data, we see that we have approximately 46% of mechanics that were considered informal workers in the country. And for these informal mechanics, if they don't transition, and again, it depends on, you know, how far this transition is going to happen and the cars that we are going to see in the South African market. But then they do risk losing revenue, and they do risk losing out on work and potential customers. And also because, again, of the nature of electric vehicles, they do risk their safety if there's no training that is implemented for informal mechanics. And so another impact would be that unqualified and poorly trained mechanics actually could negatively impact the quality of repairs. And so here in the graph, I was just showing the highest education attainment level amongst auto mechanics in 2020, and we see that the majority of them have less than a matric. And usually for auto mechanics as well as electricians, you require, I think, at least an NQF level 4. And so for electricians, because I think we might also be seeing a lot of electricians entering this market, it becomes important that they're qualified. And this is where the artisan recognition of prior learning becomes really, really important. And the program is there, but there are barriers for some of these informal mechanics and electricians to actually qualify themselves. So it becomes important to ensure that we are looking at ways to reduce those barriers so that you can have this pool of skilled non-qualified workers, not only increasing the pool of artisans, but also being able to be trained and formalized. And so also being able to reap the benefits of transitioning to EVs and, you know, getting that revenue and safety. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lesejo. I think that was extremely insightful, and, you know, it really, I think for me, it's so important to kind of, again, remember that this is all about people at the end of the day. And you know, we tend to often talk about transition in fairly abstract ways, you know, and so that really puts things back on the ground into employment and, you know, issues of skills and really just, yeah, people, as I said. Again, yeah, just friendly reminder to everyone to put your questions in the chat. I've seen a few already, and keeping track, and then we'll get into those after the inputs. We're now going to open the floor to our next panelist, Alex, who is a visiting researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at WITS. And he's been working really on you know, the interplay between economic, labor, development, and political policy communication, media, and public relations. Has worked extensively on the automotive industry, and has also an history in the trade labor movement. So we'll come with, I'm sure, a different perspective. Alex, it's really a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me firstly appreciate the two presentations just made now, and the second one on skills. And go back a little bit to the opening presentation, because it took some important information to share. Let me just start by highlighting the context, and this may be in addition to the first presentation. If we are to look at new energy vehicle context in South Africa from a sales point of view, using information from the Industry Export Council's annual export manual and NAMSA's proposals towards the green paper. As you will see on the screen, the number of new energy vehicles sold in South Africa is very, very low. And these are annual sales per category. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, very, very low from 2017 to 2022. All of them less than 130 per annum. And in total, over this period of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, 532. Hybrid electric vehicles were a bit higher than plug-in hybrid electric vehicles at 5,250 in terms of their sales from 2017 to 2022. Battery electric vehicles, to my surprise, were higher than plug-in hybrid electric vehicles at 1,092 years. In total, if you take these years, 2017 to 2022, you had 6,874 new energy vehicles sold in South Africa. Now, that is a very, very, very small domestic market. And as things stand right now, more of the production which I will come to in South Africa will be reliant on export markets. I will just highlight here. Domestically, we have already, the Mercedes-Benz was the first one to produce a hybrid vehicle, and recently Toyota followed. Exports play a key role in the two productions. Last year, in June, BMW announced that by the end of 2024, they will be producing a plug-in hybrid model. And in November, just 2 weeks before the launch of the white paper, Ford Motor Company, where I worked and where I received my training in electrical engineering maintenance, also announced that they will be building the hybrid model of the Ford Ranger, the popular Ford Ranger, by the end of this year. So in total, by the end of 2024, we will be having these 7 OEMs. BMW's investment and the Ford investment is quite huge, actually, if you consider the fact that they recently launched the new generation Ford Ranger, and the investment for the hybrid model is actually an additional one. And BMW made the investment in celebration of their 50 years of production in Rosley. So by the end of 2024, we will be doing this for original equipment manufacturers producing hybrid vehicles in South Africa. Now that will leave us with 3: VW, Mitsubishi, Nissan. And towards the end of 2024, to partner with DHL, with VW electric vans. So that is not for domestic manufacturing. Those will be imports, but I'm mentioning them because even the sales that I pointed to comprise not only domestically manufactured hybrid vehicles, but also imports. BMW, in the same way, made an announcement, in fact signed a partnership with Anglo American, Anglo Platinum, and Sasol to look at fuel cell vehicles. This will be a small scale project. It is not a manufacturing project. Sasol will supply hydrogen. I will come to that when I deal with some of the proposals from the white paper, while Anglo American will play a key role as the supplier of platinum. The first presentation, showed the sales of new energy vehicles globally. I'm raising my voice because I received a request to project. Largely, the European Union has been an external driver of many considerations made in South Africa. They had made an announcement by 2030, 2035 to prohibit imports of internal combustion engine vehicles, but there are debates there. Sometimes it is the policy is advanced, and sometimes there are these changes and further engagements. But if that goes ahead, there will be a huge impact on South Africa, given that the European Union is our major trading partner. We are exporting quite a lot to that market. China, I put it here, but it has already been covered in the first slide, insofar as it is a market for new energy vehicles. I have had 2 trips to China in 2024. I must say that South Africa can learn something from China, because the new energy vehicles sales in China, including looking at China as a market, as it was presented in the first slide, is driven by domestic automotive manufacturing. And Chinese domestic original equipment manufacturers like Build Your Dreams play a key role. It has emerged actually as a leading producer of new energy vehicles, and it has quite an extensive domestic value chain in China from when, for example, lithium is mined to when it is used and to when it is processed and used as a raw material in the production of vehicle batteries. When I was there, at least 30% of their domestic market of vehicles on the road were new energy vehicles. So if you compare that to the situation in South Africa, we are still quite far away from where China is. The first presentation drew our attention to the automotive, the white paper. The automotive Masterplan provided the automotive investment scheme at a higher benefit for new energy vehicles. And I think this was behind the announcements made by Toyota, Ford Motor Company, and BMW. And we can also expect from the white paper a more enhanced automotive investment scheme. This is quite an important industrial policy incentive. It is a cash grant for productive investment. And this is an important driver, I think, of the announcements that we made. I will leave the Auto Green Paper on new energy vehicles released in May 2021 because there were debates, and then those debates culminated in the white paper on new energy vehicles, revising quite a number of proposals that were initially in the green paper and which worried individuals like me in the industry. There is this policy that I want to put forward here just to highlight, because most of the time when we discuss the transition, we leave out the South African Green Transport Strategy 2018 to 2050. And I just want to place an emphasis from a labor point of view of this strategy. Our discussion is mostly looking at automobility. However, if you look at the South African Green Transport Strategy, it is far broader than electric vehicles. In its approach, it is anchored in integrated passenger and goods transport systems. And from where I stand, and I observe this both in the green paper as well as the white paper, there is still a lot that we need to do, because the transition should not be narrowed to a transition in automotive assembly manufacturing. The green transport strategy talks about rail, and the reason why I emphasize it is because public transport plays a key role. You think about buses, rail, you think about other modes of transportation. It is quite extensive, and as the green paper stands right now, it doesn't respond sufficiently to the South African green transport strategy, particularly from the point of view of automotive trade and industrial policy, because here you are dealing with a broader transition than the transition we've been focusing on only in automotive assembly sector and component. The component sector can play a key role and benefit if we were to go ahead and not end with the current white paper. From where things stand, we've got to respond to all the modes of transport mentioned in the green transport strategy, because they require a trade and industrial policy like the one that we are discussing right now. That is going to be important for South Africa to advance the transition comprehensively, rather than only on the roads through automotive vehicles. Now, key issues from the labor point of view, Renai has already shared some of this. They emerge from the green paper: manufacturing localization and NEV component regional value chain development. If I may combine the 2 points on the slide now. Johnson Matthey in the west of Germiston shut down its plant in October last year. The plant was manufacturing catalytic converters, and it was not the only catalytic converter affected. Now, when we talk about jobs that are at risk, it is important to appreciate that already everyone who was working at that plant or at that company and other companies that took the same decision under the same conditions, all those jobs are gone. If there were interventions, perhaps interventions that worked, perhaps that would not have been the case. Because if you look at the transition at Johnson Matthey's notice, it was not like catalytic converters are no longer in demand. All these internal combustion engine vehicles we are producing in South Africa and almost globally still require catalytic converters. So, and a catalytic converter remains a crucial component in keeping carbon emissions from the internal combustion engine. And it is still important in hybrid vehicles. But there were factors that led to the company made that decision to say they will go and produce in the European Union closer to their market. I will come to some of the underpinning in that regard. We have about 112,000 workers employed in the industry. In terms of the automotive, the South African Automotive Masterplan, the target is by 2025, we must double this employment. But unfortunately, as I just explained now, we have lost employment, and at least we've lost employment, and at least Renai is quite correct. Most of the component manufacturing in South Africa is not necessarily internal combustion engine specific technologies. However, there are components that are affected, like the one that I have just mentioned, we have already lost there. So that reverses our advance to at least 240,000 jobs in the automotive assembly sector and the components manufacturing by 2035. Now, the Johnson Matthey story is quite interesting because it mentions some of these problems. As a market, particularly for rechargeable battery electric vehicles, South Africa still has a lot to do. Imagine if you own this vehicle and you do not have an internal combustion engine vehicle, and then you are subjected to the load shedding that we experience right now. That countervails the whole momentum that we need to build the transition, while we protect the current production and employment, both in the automotive assembly sector as well as in the components manufacturing sector. The second point that I have come across in my research, especially in Europe, there is a shift in consumer sentiment from products whose production was powered by fossil fuel energy to products whose production was powered by clean energy. So in other words, it is possible that we can make good advances in manufacturing, particularly in the automotive assembly sector and in the components manufacturing sector. However, when it comes to key global regional export markets, such as the European Union, what sources did the energy that powered this production come from may act negatively against us. And some of these things were taken into consideration in the white paper. I will just highlight from the screen that Renee shared. Of course, he didn't dwell deeper into this. He mentioned logistics, but this problem of electricity is a problem. I call it a double crisis because we've got electricity under capacity crisis, but at the same time, we need to ensure that we have more clean energy powering production. Original equipment manufacturers such as Ford have put in place investments and measures to transition to clean energy. through solar panels and other forms of clean energy. So they are doing it at the company level so that they can mitigate the implications of powering production with carbon-emitting fossil fuel energy, especially in key global markets such as the European Union. Now, you will see that the green paper the white paper took these realities into consideration. There are these 10 points that remain shared, but there are additional 6 points. The first being to scale up investment in charging infrastructure. We do need that to support especially rechargeable battery electric vehicles. As the population of these vehicles increase, this infrastructure is going to be critical. However, this infrastructure is going to require an uninterrupted power supply, because to charge from this infrastructure, you order to function as it is expected. My apologies. Developing opportunities for localization of charging components is an important innovation, and developing EVs, including government-owned public transport, corporate fleets, and mining equipment. The reality as it stands now, from a labor point of view or from an employment point of view, the automotive component manufacturing sector is home to the largest proportion of employment in automotive manufacturing industry. We employ around 29,000 to 30,000 to 31,000. So for us to increase this employment, more attention is required in deepening the value chain, especially in the component sector, raising the levels of domestic value addition, especially at tiers 2 as well as tier 1. That is going to be critical, and that is going to support even the localization of the charging infrastructure. I've already referred to the grid capacity. Consumer incentives. China drove its market through consumer incentives. I've been following the policy there. They've been reviewing, they've been saying they will review it, but that played a key role. But as things stand right now, from the point of view of the subsidies that I saw in China on consumers, I'm not sure whether South Africa has the capacity to afford those particular subsidies. So as things stand, if I may just make 2 additions in conclusion, just from an employment point of view, we have 2 certificates. The first one is National Certificate, Automotive Manufacturing and Assembly. Almost the entire production workforce in the assembly sector has received training in this certificate. This is part of the readiness that Renee spoke about. So when we're saying, is the component manufacturing sector ready from a capabilities perspective, I would add that from a labor perspective, we are ready, given the 2 certificates that we have. We will just need to do more in ramping up training on automotive component manufacturing and assembly certificate. So I will leave it there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this input. Yeah, much appreciated, and I think you brought some really important points of alignments in terms of opportunities and in terms of what needs to happen going forward. We're running slightly behind schedule, so our apologies on that. I hope you can stay a little longer with us. We'll try and move swiftly into our next and less structured input. And it's really great to have with us Avinash and Chintan, who are respectively program head and senior program manager in the transport and sustainable cities program of WRI India. They're going to share the Indian experience. And in that sense, India is somewhat a few steps ahead of us, and not just because it is already 4:15 there in India, but also because they have been very proactive in their transition to e-mobility. And so really, we thank both of you for being here with us today and sharing your insights from the Indian experience. Shintan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gaylor, for inviting us to the interesting session you are having. That is always great to have more interaction, more experience being shared. And BRICS countries, and especially South Africa, has been great brother countries that we have grown across history. So I hope I'm audible, clear, and loud. So just to brief, WRI India, World Resource Institute, has multiple offices across globe and has been supporting various government internationally to the subject of climate change and how to mitigate those challenges. So our team in India, we are working on electric mobility as well as integrated sustainable mobility growth. We are supporting various cities across India, provincial governments as well as the national government. So I personally support national government in framing policies which can accelerate, especially the bus sector, which would increase the electric buses as well as the public transport share to support the sustainable mobility. So India's electric bus growth story has came out very strong. The electric vehicle market, just to give few numbers, in last financial year 2022, we had 0.45 million electric vehicles being produced. And last year, FY 2023, we have 1.18 million electric vehicle produced. So it is more than double growth which has seen in just 1 year. Bus component is also growing at a very fast pace within these various components. Okay, so when we see the bus industry, currently India has registered already more than 7,000 buses already operating on ground. More than 21,000 buses are tendered successfully, and 12,000 plus buses, even orders have been placed with the bus manufacturers, and they are expected to deliver these 12,000 buses in next year. So we have plans ahead. We have an NEBP program. We'll go through the details, which talks about 50,000 plus buses being run in the public sector. Okay, so various policy initiatives were taken for the bus program. So when we made our bus electric mission programs, so it was not randomly which came that let's start procuring buses. During 2011 to 2013, a lot of working white papers were made by government, mission plan, national mobility electric mission, and national electric mobility plans were made, which gave an entire ground of what all things will have to be done to scale up electric vehicles more sustainably in India. In 2015, the FAME scheme was launched for two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and four-wheelers. Okay, because they were more affordable. They were trying to get into that range where purchasing parity is there and public can start getting it. But when you go into the bus domain, it is a public vehicle going to carry hundreds of people per day, so their safety and growth has to be more sustainable and important. So how we can make it more compatible and safe? So these years, which we saw before the buses were also brought into fame in 2017, we worked on the certification, safety standard, charging infrastructure standards, bus specifications, homologation standards, and then only after it was assured that this safety and industry can go sustainably. So to the first lot of 400 electric buses across 10 cities was taken as a pilot. So they said that let's see, still the buses are 2.5 to 3 times costlier. And even that time total cost of operation per kilometer was also very high. So we wanted to test the waters, what we are entering into, and to bring that cost down. 60% of subsidy was even given up to 0.12 million for procuring the bus to these 10 cities. Once the success of these 10 cities was seen, the learnings came, that what kind of scale of operation is required, what kind of bus products will be required. We decided into that, okay, now we are ready with this 2 years of an experience, that now we can launch for more than 5,000 buses. So the program further was added for 5,600 buses. 73 cities got sanction of these buses, and this time, instead of providing 60% subsidy, the government decided that let's go based on battery size, because battery size requirement for different cities is different. If you go for a 60% capex cost, cities, whether they require or not, they will start purchasing higher batteries. So it is indirectly adding to the cost of operations, but you will have to optimize based on the battery size. So we said per kilowatt hour battery, let's give it a shot. And then the fame came. 2019, it was there, more than 2,000-3,000 buses were tendered out, and then the COVID came. And because the COVID came, we had small cities were facing that challenge of getting into the e-bus operations because it was still getting costly. The reason of being costly was the small lot sizes, 25 buses, 100 buses, 150 buses. So what we said that, and each city had a different requirement of battery size, seating requirement, and they had different contract arrangements. So each time OEM have to, for those 50, 100 buses, were going for different kind of models, different kind of legal reviews of their contracts. So there was a lot of complexity in the system. So we said, after the COVID, we said, let's do a demand aggregation for big cities. They are ready to cater to this kind of cost, and let's try with a demand aggregation. So we went into that 9 cities are eligible, and out of which 5 participated. And that was the first biggest tender in India of 5,500 buses. After, we'll go into the detailing couple of slides. And the next, with this success, next year, there was demand of more 6,500 buses. And recently, government has approved funding for 10,000 buses also for smaller cities. So we'll go through this. So in demand aggregation, what we saw that if you standardize your product, if you homogenize your requirement, if you make standard contracts, so that makes an investor or an OEM more confident in building their industry practices. They are not going to change their industry manufacturing unit just for few hundred buses. Okay, so, and each lot, each city having a different kind of a requirement. So if you homogenize, it is like a wholesale market creation at a place, and they will give you, they are ready to convert into their manufacturing capacities into your requirement. They are ready to invest more, and because they are investing more at a larger scale, they are ready to give you at a better price. So when demand aggregation came, what we saw that just 5 cities which were having a good demand of 5,000 buses, the cost which were achieved, which were earlier 30 to 40% more, after the demand aggregation, the the drop was seen that the benefits were achieved up to 20% better than diesel and CNG buses. So the demand aggregation not only scaled up the industry, but that also reduced the cost of procurement of the services. So one thing what we changed was change from a procurement of model to a service-based model. So instead of buying a bus, buy a service on a per kilometer basis. So that reduced the cost of operation, and different parameters across the tenders were looked into. Like earlier, what kind of life of bus would be there, how many kilometers it can run, how many times the battery will have to be replaced, what would be the assured guaranteed kilometers. So whether whichever is a season, whichever is your conditions, what kind of an assured kilometer you are guaranteeing, what kind of an opportunity charging mechanisms you are giving, what is the range of battery. So you are standardizing the range, because all these cities were of similar categories, similar travel demands, similar requirement of fleet utilization. So based on that, 12 meter, 9 meter, 200, 180 kilometers of range was decided. So this kind of standardizations were done, and based on the success of the grand challenge 5,500 buses, national electric bus program came, which further said that 5,000 is not enough for me. Now we will go for 50,000 buses. So when national NEBP program came, when an industry is investing in you, investing in your country, what they need a confidence that this is not a one time. If I'm investing, my investment, any industry does an investment for 30 years, 50 years, they have a long time investment program. So you cannot give them a vision which is for 2 years or 5 years. So they said, okay, after 5,000, we are preparing for 50,000. And then, therefore, the NEBP program talked about 50,000 buses, and the market started developing. And it was focused on how to finance these buses, how to make ensure localization of this bus production, and improve the supply chain. That value addition would be there. So how to make this market more stable. Okay, so these benefits were again further translated into the tenders of 6,500 buses, and again those kind of benefits were seen. The grand challenge still had the subsidies, where it was achieving 20% benefit over diesel on price parity. The NEBP program came without subsidies, and still it had that kind of benefits over those services. So when we compared over last 5 to 6 years, the cost which we saw in early 2018 to 20, when the small tenders by individual cities were going on, the cost was almost going around $1 to $1.25 per kilometer. But as the grand challenge and NEBP program came, and we worked on with the government on demand aggregation model, the cost dropped drastically, and the costs are now $7.75 per kilometer for 12-meter buses. So this kind of change came just because we started aggregating a demand and kind of market which was developed, that kind of vision which was seen by OEMs. They were ready to invest in that bigger market. Okay, and then recently, so now till now it was only going for the bigger cities. What recent scheme which was launched talked about in last August. There is a Prime Minister e-bus scheme which came. It announced support for 169 smaller cities. Now they said that smaller cities don't have that budget. So instead of giving capex-based subsidies, we will give OPEX-based subsidies to these cities. So you on a PPP models, the buses will be procured in a demand aggregation model by central government, and these buses will be distributed to these 169 cities, and the total project cost being $6.9 billion. Government of India is contributing $2.4 billion. And this fund is for buses as well as depots, as well as power infrastructure, ticketing. So entire ecosystem will be built across these cities. So the electric bus ecosystem develops holistically, and that infrastructure which will be developed will be for years to come, and that will keep rolling on and support cities in their future ventures also. So when we see within 3 to 4 months of this program launch, more than 51 cities participated, and around 4,000 buses have already been sanctioned. Tomorrow is the last day of bid. So we are expecting more than 7 OEMs participating in the program and going to support more this first lot of 4,000 buses. The next lot would come post the central elections. But before elections, we are going to finalize this 4,000 buses, and the remaining buses shall continue. Tenders will happen, and buses will continue to come on ground by 2026. So quickly going through after these case studies, or the initiatives from the government side on creating a public bus base driven ecosystem. What we saw that in 2015, when first pilot bus came, it was just a couple of buses by OEMs getting tested here and there. There was not much demand being created. But as FAME scheme came in 2017 and FAME 2 came in 2019, there was a growth which was seen. And after COVID, when the grand challenge in NEBP kind of a program came, there is a sudden growth in kind of electric bus registration acceptance being coming with better rates received by the bus sectors, the public bus transport operators. So that growth is there. And with the new scheme which is coming, we have another 22,000 buses already tendered, of which 12,000 are planned to be delivered in 2024, and remaining will still continue to come in 2025. So next couple of years now, our industries are seeing that yes, we have a demand and they can keep growing their production cycle. Okay, so now we are saying that our aim is not limiting. We increase from those 400 buses to 5,000 buses, then 50,000 buses, and we are still not saturated. We want more. So if that government shows that intensity, that policies are being framed, you are there in a market where the demand and supply will be ensured. So OEMs, industries, ancillary charging infrastructure industries, everyone will start contributing. The battery manufacturers, everyone will start putting their heavyweights in and invest in you. So we are looking that our demand is almost like 300,000 vehicles, and at least if we target 30% of it to be achieved by 2030, 87,000 buses are minimum required. That is our commitment as per which are given in during the Paris Agreement or other international platforms, that we want to achieve 30% of vehicles being registered before 2030. So that is a big number which we are looking, and we are all our policies are being aligned to it. What we are also looking is, just to give a glimpse, our current composition of buses of almost like 1.67 million buses, private sector is almost half of it. Public buses are only 150,000, plus there are educational buses and other buses which are 300,000 each. So what we were till now, government saw that the buses, because the initial capex is very high. We cannot force private bus industry to scale up or forcefully push them or give kind of an incentives to so much big level. We started with that public industry, and that public industry we are going at a genuine pace. But if we want to target more, then what is the next? Okay, so what we have, this is from a document which we created with Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog is a government's highest think tank. It is a government body which drives policies in India. With them we worked, and we said that by 2035, that is coming 10 to 12 years, it is possible that government can scale up to 2.5 lakh buses. But thereafter, we also need to look forward for private buses. So there is a potential for 680,000 private buses also, but they cannot maybe force towards it, but at least we can start increasing by 10, 20, 30%. And how policies will have to be transitioned. Let's look into picture and target them. So currently with Ministry of Heavy Industries, who is focusing on the scaling up of industries. In December second last week, we had multiple rounds of discussions with stakeholders, operators, manufacturers, financiers, and we deliberated on, is 800,000 possible, or what will you have to do? So what came out was subsidies today are necessary because we are trying to achieve a parity of cost of operations. As in earlier capex, which was 240 million for 12-meter bus, is now 190 million already. So already capex cost is coming down. Our OPEX cost is coming down with demand aggregation. But is this kind of a subsidy government can take for next 3 to 5 years maximum, and for some 50,000 buses or 60,000 buses. But what next? Okay, so we cannot depend on providing subsidies for thousands and thousands and millions of buses. So what can be done? So our current consultations with ministries is going on that next policy reforms would be needed. For example, our OEMs would also require capital to develop or scale up their industries. So where is this capital available? What kind of financing arrangements can be made available for them, through whether commercial banks, through non-commercial banks, through clean financing funds? What can be done? Similarly, can today, if the tenure for debt is only 5 to 7 years, can we increase it? Because life of electric bus is more than a diesel bus. So can banks policies be changed that tenure of debt can be more, such that so that the interest can go down, which can make bus more affordable to operate? Is there possibility to bring bus as a capital good rather than and can it be hence converted from recourse based financing to non-recourse based financing? So what all reform based measures can be adopted? We are focusing on them. Parallelly, in private sector, we are looking if we can enter into school buses, institutional buses, which are the low-hanging fruit, which are because these require a very low capacities batteries and can scale up very fast. So around this, the discussion is happening. So just a last slide on what kind of policies have been changed and we are looking to reform these industries. Okay, so as Alex also talked about localization. Okay, so we have been talking about promoting manufacturing in India. When we see a kind of numbers, whether it is for 2, 3, 4 wheelers or whether it is for buses, we cannot keep on importing from outside. Okay, so we have to manufacture in India. It cannot happen in day one that 100% buses are here, but manufactured here. But Made in India initiative is taken, where OEMs are asked that they should have at least one production plant here, and they would be registered here. They would be permitted with certain capacities. Today, there are 7 OEMs, couple of more are also ready to register. 34,000 buses they can produce annually. That is the permit with this total production capacity in India, while tenders which are through government have been ordered are expecting 12 to 15,000 buses being supplied annually to government. So they still have a capacity where they can supply to private operators. Now, that therefore we are also looking how private sector can also be encouraged. Private operators can also be encouraged to get these buses. So when COVID came, you all know there was economic stress across globe. So that time production linked incentives, which also was going to boost Make in India, was promoted. Here production linked incentive was provided such that different industries, such like including automotive industries, we also had renewable energy, we also had advanced chemistries, we also had power electronics being funded. Automotive industry was provided $6 billion to such that the industries which scale up their production will get incentive for that delta exchange in that particular year. So that incentives would be provided for improving your production capacities. So that actually helped the economy to recover through COVID period also, as well as it started building that base of that industry. So in automotive industries, including buses, all 2-wheeler, 4-wheelers, everyone started participating there. So it is open for all on first come first basis, but it started growing that industry, electric vehicle industry also. And in phase wise manufacturing program, what we said was that on day one, obviously you cannot have, so bus have a different components. Okay, so there is a bus body, and there is power electronics, powertrain, there is battery, and there are so and so and 4 components. So for say bus body, 90 to 100% of components should be produced in India. Okay, for powertrain or something, you have 40 to 50%. So for each type of components, you have given a threshold limit of manufacturing, and you have to grow it over the years. So that kind of thresholds were also provided in development of batteries, chargers, motors, and encourage that phase-wise manufacturing. In case of that was more from improving the supply side. Now also looking from the demand side, if we looked into so many schemes such as FAME scheme which came, or the PM electric bus scheme which came, which talked about giving incentive to cities so that they are encouraged to operate electric buses rather than the diesel or CNG buses. Okay, so we have to one side we were creating that supply confidence, and we were also creating that demand confidence. So incentives for electric bus adoptions were given for cities as discussed in the schemes. Demand aggregation standardization was put to to homogenize the product, to create that market at scale. And for financing mechanism for public sector, we have already working with Ministry of Heavy Industries in association with US government, where they are ready to fund almost $1 billion almost $500 million. They will contribute to this payment security fund, where the mechanism works such that if there is a default of payment to any operator, those funds can be initiated, and the payments to the industry OEMs operators are made on time such that their cash flow and are not affected to provide continuity with the industry. And similar kind of a mechanism is currently being discussed, what can be done for a private sector. So private sector also gets that kind of a confidence in to address those financial challenges. So these are the key 5-6 pillars on which our electric bus industry is growing. And thanks. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Chetan. I think that was fascinating. I've heard this presentation before, but I never get tired of hearing it. It's a really great, a great experience, and lots to learn from the Indian experience. So really great. We are somewhat behind schedule on our end. Clearly, we under budgeted in terms of time. Thank you so much for for staying with us a little longer. I just want to give our presenters the opportunity for some final remarks as we draw to a close. I just, while we do that, point out some of the key questions that we're coming through in the chat, and that hopefully you can touch upon in your concluding remarks. There was quite a bit of emphasis on building the value chain, particularly from mining and critical minerals, and how we can leverage that potentially to build batteries and other NEV components. There was some questions as well around how we can integrate into some of those new EV companies, the likes of Tesla, but BYD, who are clearly at the cutting edge and leading by many respects the market, not globally, but have their own supply chain, of course, like any other company. Are we ready to tap into those and to deploy ourselves into those value chains? Another key theme that I saw in the chat was around the role of finance. How can we get our DFIs, our development finance institutions, to really backing our sector? We know we have great strengths already, but are we prepared to pony up some money to support our industry? What is the role of R&D, and how we again ready to provide technology, and are we ready to implement those technologies? Where are our pockets of excellence, or should we be a fast adopters of those new technologies? There's also some questions around maintenance of EVs and the impact that would have certainly on the industry, and similarly, I think the financing models of vehicles, how people purchase and finance those vehicles. Are we going to see some impact on that as we transition to electric vehicles? And of course, the applicability as well of the Indian experience, to our local context. I mean, we don't have the same volumes that India has, and so what can we replicate and learn from those experiences? So these are some questions that came from the chat. I mean, feel free to touch on some of them, as well as any other input that you want to make. I'll give you about 1 minute each to make some final comments. Start with Lesero.
Thank you so much for that, Gaylor. I did try to respond to some of the maintenance questions, but I think one thing that came up in the chat as well that I would like to point to is just the issue around just how slow this skills training and upskilling might be. And I think that for me points to collaboration and partnerships, especially when it comes to skills development and training in the country. And this is not just partnerships and collaborations with local stakeholders, which is very important, being labor, government, business, as well as the education sector as well. So Department of Basic Education as well as DHET really need to be involved. And I think also what we're seeing in the automotive industry, what's been very interesting is that initially, you know, Masita has always been a very key skills and training partner in this industry. But now, because of the battery technologies, we're also seeing the importance of the chemical SETA, the EW SETA. And so those partnerships and collaborations are really, really important. And we've seen it in the lithium ion battery industry that, you know, collaborating with local and international stakeholders has actually enabled the South African industry to create those pockets of excellence that you mentioned, and to actually create some sort of a skills basis and a skills foundation when it comes to understanding some of these emerging technologies, specifically the battery technology. So of course it's going to take time, but I think, you know, with the right investment and also the right partners, it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesego. You know, and I like the optimism, of course. Renai, over to you.
Yeah, I want to just hone in on a couple of the follow-up points. The first being around how do we leverage value chain opportunities with some of the emerging kind of leaders that we're seeing in the space, especially those coming from the East. So I think A, as a supplier constituency, but B, also as a country, we've got a lot of experience in being able to extract out of global partnerships and the like. And I think our auto sector is a really good example of that. So given that policies are in place to attract new entrants, both in terms of an OEM space or even opening up export markets, I don't see it being too challenging to see those kind of global partnerships being formed as well. If you think of any OEM, whether it's in the EV space or not, looking to come into South Africa, they will bring in their own base of global suppliers. And I think you'll find that the South African lower tier component manufacturers in that space, tier 2, tier 3, will be able to then find opportunities into those big global partners. So for me, I think it's more of an opportunity. It's not a threat. It's not something we should be looking at and saying, hey, you know, these are out there. How do we kind of protect from them? And then, Gaylor, I want to maybe close my input. I've obviously spoken a lot in terms of the value chain and how do we position ourselves in emerging technology. It is not the only emerging technology that we're seeing. And I want to close with maybe this thought for us all as custodians and interested parties in the SA Autos value chain. I think the EV opportunity has kind of been on our radar for some time. It is clear, it's present. There's a white paper to now guide our engagements. I'm still a firm believer that markets will change. Markets are changing globally. The narrative is not exclusively battery electric vehicle anymore in terms of where OEMs are positioning their own kind of product transition in terms of the carbon requirements. And I think we are probably in the midst of an interesting mix of product, A, that's coming to us as consumers, but B, also coming to us in terms of the production landscape. And I think it's really important that we've got a policy framework that is able to adapt and respond to different technologies while giving immediate impetus to where the EV discussion is. So I'm going to stop there. I've seen a lot of chat on why not harder this for EV, and there's a space for all of that. But if there's a view that it's exclusively government that's going to deliver all of that, I think it's misguided. I think there's private public sector type approaches, even private sector responses that need to happen to unlock any market opportunity.
Great, no, fantastic. Thank you for that. I think it's proactive, but let's keep our options open and our eyes on the ball and developments. So heard loud and clear. Alex, last few words from your side.
Just last few words from my side. I cannot overemphasize the importance of developing the component manufacturing sector, raising the levels of domestic manufacturing value addition. And the reason why I have chosen to just close with this point on is that when I looked at the European Union South Africa agreement, or what the literature in this regard policy says about trade policy, particularly duties, we are required to at least build 60% of local value addition in the vehicles produced in the country in order for us to qualify for duty-free benefits in key markets. And when you look at the white paper, among its interventions or actions, it has these engagements to maintain or secure duty-free access, and raising the levels of domestic manufacturing capacity is going to be crucial. We will have to learn from India as well. And I can also overemphasize the importance of a comprehensive green transport transition, because mostly now our focus is on the automotive manufacturing industry, but we need an integrated approach, looking at transport as a whole and informed by the fact that this transition is there to cap carbon emissions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. I think that puts things into perspective as well. And yes, it is part of a broader transition, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I think the point that you make as well on access to markets based on rules of origin is critical. It's something that that is known, but often forgotten. Chintan, you'll have the last word from the panelist. Anything you want to reflect on or add?
Yeah, just quickly. I would say there is no doubt that electric vehicles would take over the current form which automobile industry is there. So irrespectively they are coming, it is our duty that we should frame our pathway, our policies such that growth is organized and sustainable, and it has to be done very strategically on time. So government's role in designing those policy framework while keeping in mind all the stakeholders on the ecosystem, they have to see there is a balance, risk balance, for their investments, for the market, that whether it is OEMs, operators, cities, charging infrastructure, battery manufacturers, everyone, that goes hand in hand. You cannot have a disbalanced kind of an approach. So government's responsibility would be there to organize the policies such that this goes in a more sustainable way, and each vehicle added would be adding to the greener future for us. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for these words of wisdom, Chintan. Really good. That takes us to the end. Thank you for staying a little longer with us. I think it was so rich, and as usual, we could have gone longer. But I want to thank our panelists, Lesejo, Renai, Alex, Chintan, for their time and the insight and the really wonderful inputs that they've made. I want to thank you, of course, for attending today and staying with us. And hopefully you found the discussion as enriching as I did. We will share with you the presentations as well as the recording. And please be on the lookout for the next event, which will be on the 6th of March on hydrogen and industrial policy. We'll have a panel from TIPS, from the University of Johannesburg Center for Competition, Regulation and Development, the IDC, WITS, and DSI. So much to look forward to. Until next time, keep well and stay safe.